My husband stole from his parents' company. He did it slowly, small transfers at first, then larger ones, and he lied to me for years about where our money came from. It hurt because finance was the one place we promised each other we would never keep secrets. We built our life around numbers, rent, tuition, the monthly saving plan for our son. When I found the spreadsheet with the diverted accounts and the coded entries under his username, it felt like he had turned all of our shared years into a ledger of betrayals. I should say that I didn't expose him out of malice. I exposed him because the ledger was going to drag me and our son into a lie I couldn't live with. It wasn't a dramatic moment. There was no scream, no confrontation with the company CEO or the family matriarch in a courtroom. Right? It started in my kitchen on a Wednesday night with him washing a pan, humming, and me scrolling through emails on his laptop to check something as ordinary as a flight confirmation. The equity transfers were there, plain as daylight. I could have closed the laptop and pretended not to see. I didn't. I printed the documents the next morning and sent them to the family lawyer, then to the company's internal audit. By Friday, the family that had once opened their home to me on holidays and called me by a nickname I didn't particularly like, the steady one, was looking at my husband like someone who had been caught doing something monstrous. They disowned him the following week. Their faces when they closed the door on him, that calm, silent disapproval was the only real prize I had ever wanted. We were young when we married. He was 28, from a family that owned a mid-sized manufacturing company in the Midwest. I was 26, a city girl with student debt and enough stubbornness to last through late nights in audit rooms and bar exam prep. He had a quiet charm and a way of saying, well, we'll be okay. That became my default setting. For the first 3 years, we had nothing to fall back on but each other and the small apartment above a convenience store. After he got more responsibilities at his family's company, we moved into a modest house in the suburbs. 3 bedrooms, a yard that needed to be mowed, a mortgage that felt like an adult badge. His parents paid for college loans, sometimes for furniture, and there were expectations I learned to read in the way his mother would clear plates without asking, and in the way his father's eyes would skim financial statements at dinner. The power imbalance was obvious from the start. They had wealth and status, and I had an hourly job and a nervous habit of second-guessing myself. There were unwritten rules. Rule 1, you never question how a business is run. Rule 2, you do not interfere in family matters. Rule 3, loyalty to the family brand came before individual grievances. My husband grew up within that framework. He loved his parents in the practical, filial way many of us learn. Calls every Sunday, bringing them roast for holidays, deferring to his father at business dinners. When he told me, we'll be okay, I never thought the we included hiding things from me. So I couldn't simply leave because leaving would mean throwing our son's stability into the wind. He was 7 when I discovered the transfers. He had a 3rd grade classroom he loved, a soccer team with practice every Tuesday, and a stubborn attachment to the stuffed rabbit he'd had since infancy. We had a mortgage with 3 years left on the fixed rate and no cushion large enough to pay both daycare and rent without cutting deeply into food and school supplies. There were community obligations too. My job offered health insurance that would have been prohibitively expensive on my own, And he had been the one to negotiate flexible hours with my boss after I was promoted. Leaving would have meant not only emotional upheaval for our son, but a practical impossibility. No money, no clear housing, a legal morass if I decided to fight. I stayed because someone had to keep our life together the morning after the revelation, and because I could not abandon the pattern of dependence I recognized in myself. The first escalation was quiet, a slow, cutting withdrawal of goodwill. The week after I sent the documents to the lawyer, his family began treating me like an accessory to his crime instead of the person who had protected the company's integrity. At a memorial dinner for a longtime family friend, his uncle asked me in a voice that resembled curiosity, "Did you know?" My husband sat between us and didn't answer. He didn't look at me. The uncle's question was the shape of a knife. I wanted to tell the truth, that I had told the lawyer to preserve the company and protect the employees whose pensions would be at risk. But my husband's eyes were on the table, his jaw tight. He had not yet forgiven me. When I tried to explain later, he said, "You were supposed to tell me first." It wasn't about protocol, it was about power. By telling them, I had taken a decision away from him. By telling them, I had stripped him of the chance to navigate his failure on his own terms. He saw that as betrayal. The consequence was immediate. He withdrew money from our joint account without telling me and moved it into an old savings account he'd opened when we were first married. The transfers were small, 500 here, 1,000 there, but they mattered because they were deliberate and secretive. When I confronted him, he said he was protecting me from his family's rage. The situation got worse because while he hid the money, his family posted photographs of him on social media smiling at charity events. They kept up appearances while accusing him privately of endangering the company. The public disapproval was surgical. They made sure the company board heard whispered concerns about his judgment, while they reserved their loudest condemnation for our home. Pressure turned to exclusion. Invitations stopped arriving. We no longer had holiday dinners with his parents. Our son, previously doted on by grandparents, got fewer phone calls and fewer presents. They stopped attending his games. Their absence was deliberate and public. They wanted him to feel it. The first time our son said, "Grandma didn't come to my game," his voice was flat, as if he had rehearsed the disappointment. I felt my leverage slip away with every missed call. They used my son as a tool without asking permission, resentment disguised as restraint. Next came humiliation. My husband's sister, someone I had once considered a friend, sent a group text to family members calling the exposure an assault and implying that I had engineered the whole thing to wrest control of the estate. My husband didn't publicly defend me. Instead, he showed anger at the accusation that I had ulterior motives. That anger somehow felt worse than being accused by strangers because it suggested that he believed them. It suggested that even after marriage, I was expendable if it meant saving him from his own mistakes. The humiliation had a financial sting too. The company's shareholders began whispering about replacing his position, which meant he lost the salary bump that had been promised for the next quarter. Without that bump, the mortgage became heavier, the credit card balance more prominent. I reacted by trying to hold on to what I could control: our home, our son's routine, my job. I tightened our budget, sold the nicest set of dining chairs we had, and picked up weekend shifts. I stopped accepting invitations because the fewer public moments we had, the less ammunition they would find to humiliate us. But the family escalated by using legal pressure. They filed papers to have him removed from certain company roles pending audit findings. The notice said he may have breached fiduciary duties, and it was filed with such clinical precision that it made our living room feel like a court. My husband, who had once been confident in negotiations and plans, became pale. He stopped making eye contact with me at night. He called me from the office and left messages. "I'm trying to fix this. Please trust me." When I answered, the voice on the line had the brittle edge of someone who had been pushed to the limit. The fourth escalation was interpersonal violence of a subtle sort, manipulation. His parents began telling mutual friends that our marriage was the breaking point and that I had pressured him into making decisions he would not have otherwise made. A neighbor confessed that he overheard his mother on the phone saying, "She's ambitious," as if ambition were a crime. They adapted a narrative where I was the outward threat to their family's cohesion. The gravity of what he had done was reframed into a story where my actions were the cause. That manipulation struck at the core of our social life. Friends unfriended me on social media. People who had once invited us to furniture-warming parties sent polite, neutral messages. A fellow parent stopped chatting with me at pickup. The sense of being enclosed by a shrinking circle was slow poison. I reacted to manipulation with facts. I brought bank statements to meetings. I prepared a timeline of the transfers, and I sat with auditors to find the paper trail. Every time I presented more evidence, the family responded with stories about his childhood, about how he'd always been generous, how he had once lent money to an ailing cousin. They framed his theft as a lapse in judgment, not a pattern. It's a tactic I recognized, appeal to nostalgia to dilute culpability. The consequence was that the auditors broadened their scope, and the company's legal team opened a formal investigation that would not be resolved overnight. The situation got worse because the uncertainty dragged on. Legal ambiguity is corrosive. Our son began hearing adult voices raised late at night. He started waking with nightmares and asking if he would have to move schools. Humiliation returned, but this time it hit my son. At school, a classmate asked him why his dad's company had problems. Children have a way of repeating what they hear in a way that drags private matters into the light. When I went to the school to complain, the principal suggested a counselling referral for our son and said, with professional distance, that rumours could harm a child's social standing. The principal's kind words felt like admission that our son's childhood had been altered. At home, my husband began sleeping on the couch. He would wake at 3 a.m. and watch the ceiling. One night he whispered, "If I had told them sooner, maybe they would have forgiven me." That maybe was a broken bridge. Forgiveness was not a sure currency when parents saw betrayal as contagious. The low point arrived in a way that seemed almost ordinary. We lost leverage all at once. His family removed his personal access to company accounts pending investigation, froze certain benefits he had received, and quietly advised him to step down from supervisory tasks. He had been the connector in so many ways, friends with board members, the one with the ear of his father. When that was gone, he was alone in a way I had not anticipated. The board's recommendation to suspend him and to consider legal action if the audit concluded unfavourably was delivered by certified mail. The letter included a clause that, if his actions were deemed criminal, they would pursue restitution. Our joint finances were suddenly under a microscope, and I felt naked. I felt trapped, abandoned, and utterly exhausted. One evening, after a day of meeting with a family mediator who refused to meet our eyes and kept offering neutral solutions that always helped the company more than a family, I sat on our porch while our son slept and cried in a way I hadn't since my father's funeral. The quiet was heavy. I could feel what being abandoned looked like. The plate left on the sideboard untouched, the voicemail that went unanswered, the silence from those who had once used our house as a staging ground for parties. My husband knocked on the door and asked if I would consider moving back in with his parents until this blew over. He meant it as a practical choice. He thought they would be less harsh if we were under their roof. I looked at him and understood that moving back meant sending our son into a house where his grandparents had already voted to disown their father. It would be a surrender. That night, I packed a small bag and drove to my mother's. I didn't tell my husband where I was going. I couldn't afford to be seen as someone who would cooperate with the family as they tightened their grip. My mother let me sleep on the pull-out couch and offered coffee in the morning. Her apartment had that smell of old books and patchwork comforters, a safety built on small, boring things. In the quiet of my mother's kitchen, I felt my leverage dissolve and my options narrow to the few that still allowed my son to be safe. The turning point was not some cinematic confession. It was a mistake. My husband, in his unrest, left his old phone in the glove compartment of his car while he took the commute shuttle to the company. He liked to keep old devices as a clumsy archive of past conversations. I found it that afternoon while looking for receipts for tax purposes. I almost didn't open it. Old phones have the same danger as old diaries. They contain fragments of selves you'd rather not see. But this device had an open note, an unsent message to his sister, with a subject line that read, "Plain and ugly. How we hide it." The note wasn't finished, but the sentences were enough. It included names, dates, a sequence of transfers matching the ledger I had already found, and crucially, a single line that explained why the family had reacted the way they did. They weren't shocked to find out he had taken money because they had all, at some point, it's benefited from similar adjustments to the books. I sat at my mother's table with the phone in my hand and reread that line 20 times. It shifted the power dynamic, not because it absolved him, but because it reframed the story. The family's disowning was an attempt to contain risk, to perform moral outrage in a way that would protect the brand and the shares. They weren't outraged at the principle of theft so much as frightened by the possibility of public exposure. The phone note showed that the family in private had facilitated similar moves and had encouraged him to do favors that maintained appearances. It meant their moral high ground was not solid. I didn't celebrate. I felt the heavy responsibility of knowing more than I used to. I called the lawyer who had opened the audit and asked for a meeting. I set the old phone on the table and asked them to run a deeper search for communications within the company and between family members. I said nothing about sleeping in my mother's spare room. I said nothing about the look on my husband's face when I placed the phone on the kitchen table and told him calmly that it was time to tell the truth. I chose to expose because the alternative was a slow, grinding erasure. If the family was going to pretend to be outraged while quietly shuffling funds, Our son would grow up believing that lies could be normalized. Exposing him was a defensive act. It was to stop the normalizing and to let the chips fall where they would. I recorded my husband's confession on a voice memo. He agreed to it, but I did not stage it as a trap. He spoke with the tone of someone who had been caught but who still wanted to control the narrative. He admitted the transfers had started when he had taken on a role that required him to smooth out payroll in a failing division. He blamed pressure, the company's expectations, and a panic over losing status. He said he'd been trying to pay back before anyone noticed. He looked like a man on a ledge. The consequences were immediate and realistic. The board expanded the scope of the investigation. The company filed for an independent forensic accounting audit. The family, feeling the exposure of their own private actions, rushed to limit fallout. They severed formal ties with him, board seats revoked, honorary titles removed, invitations rescinded, with statements expressing deep disappointment and commitment to transparency. They announced donations to the pension fund to offset any immediate harm, but they did it grudgingly, as if the donation was a cost of doing the right thing rather than a restoration of a wrong. My husband, confronted with both his actions and the family's attempt at damage control, stepped down from his positions. There was no dramatic arrest. There were months of legal negotiation, of meetings with the company's counsel, of a restitution plan that promised to repay damages over a period that would stretch well beyond our son's childhood. The family's disowning was public now and final. They issued statements that included the phrase, "We will always support those harmed by our company's recent challenges." Their faces at the shareholders' meeting, polished, controlled, looked like theatre. The shock on their faces the first time they realised their private misdeeds could be exposed was visceral. They had been trained to look a certain way in public, but the ledger and the phone note were the kind of evidence that made practiced calm crack. I saw for the first time this strange private panic that comes when your illusion of control is ripped away. Their shocked faces were, yes, a kind of currency. They meant I had changed the distribution of risk. They were worth something intangible, the price of honest reckoning. But exposure didn't make everything right. It did not restore the tidy family dinners or the easy laughter at holiday tables. It did not erase our son's nightmares overnight. It did not instantaneously give us a new safety net. The consequence was a slow, pragmatic reordering of our life. Legally, we negotiated a settlement that allowed us to keep the house in exchange for relinquishing certain claims on his family's assets. He took a job in a different industry, a modest salary compared to what he had been promised. He sold a car and cashed out a small inheritance fund he had set aside years ago. We moved to a smaller town where the commute was longer but the rent cheaper. We carved our days into new routines: after-school pickup, part-time remote work, a conservative budget that felt like a diet after excess. Emotionally, the consequences were more complicated. My husband carried shame like a physical thing. He was quieter, less sure. He tried to rebuild trust with our son through small, consistent acts: homework help, early morning breakfasts, Saturday park visits. He apologised in ways that were practical. He volunteered at the local community centre, where some of the displaced employees had moved. He attended restitution hearings and he met with financial counsellors. He stopped promising impossible fixes and started delivering small, believable ones. That shift mattered more than any public statement. It was the slow, patient work of showing up without a theater of excuses. The family are now publicly disowned, pivoted to protection. They tried to seal records, to negotiate non-disclosure agreements with the auditors, and to spin the narrative into one of familial forgiveness when the public had moved on. I declined offers that felt like backhanded attempts to buy silence. When his mother called and said gently, "We want peace for the children," I heard the subtext, "Return, recant, and accept the old order." I declined. I could see where reconciliation would come at the cost of truth. I had chosen otherwise. The payoff was not a triumphant moment. There was no courtroom scene where I threw the ledger on a table and received applause. The payoff was quieter. My son sleeping without nightmares after 3 months of counseling. My husband finding steady, honest work that paid less but allowed him to be present. And a kind of domestic peace that was thin but reliable. Financially, we were constrained but self-sustaining. We made choices that felt grown up, an emergency fund, a plan for college that relied on scholarships and part-time work, a decision to move closer to public transport, to save on car costs. The emotional satisfaction came from watching my son laugh without searching for the shadow in my face. There were consequences for the family too. The company's stock dipped for a while. Some long-tenured board members retired amid the scandal. They had to restructure governance and publicly commit to stricter oversight. The family's social standing contracted. Invitations were fewer. Philanthropic opportunities shifted toward third-party management. They tried to rebuild behind closed doors, but there was a new scrutiny that could not be undone. That consequence was real and measured. It was not a fantasy revenge, but a legitimate change in how the world perceived them. In the end, what mattered was the sort of quiet integrity that no amount of family influence could buy back. It was the kind of integrity that comes from choosing to expose a truth because the alternative would have been to let a lie grow. I have mixed feelings about my role. I will not say I do not regret the pain it caused my husband. There is a private sorrow that threads through ordinary nights. But I also understand that small choices aggregate. The spreadsheet I found didn't appear overnight, and the family's institutions did not become corrupt in a day. It was a pattern that required stopping. Our son is older now, 10, and he has learned what accountability looks like in a practical sense. He helps with budgeting homework, which is something I never expected a child to take seriously, but he does. He asks questions and I answer them plainly. He asks fewer questions about loyalty and more about how to keep promises to himself. My husband and I have learned to disagree without fear of escalation. We have also learned to accept that some relationships will not mend. His parents invited us to Thanksgiving last year. We declined. It was not spite. It was a decision based on the fact that their presence came with terms we would not sign. I suppose what I have left you with is not a tidy ending, but a reasonable one. The sheets of our life are not perfect. They have stains and we cover them with practical laundry. I don't look for vindication in the shocked faces of his family. The faces were a momentary satisfaction, the odd human recognition that their control had been interrupted. But it does not replace the day-to-day calm I wanted when I first married. The important thing is that our son sleeps through the night, that we are stable in ways that matter, and that we pay our bills without lying. If there's anything I would tell someone in the place I once sat, it is this: secrecy is expensive. The bill comes due in ways you do not expect, socially, emotionally, and financially. When you see evidence that someone you love is harming others, the choice to expose them is hard, not because it ends the relationship, but because it reorients every dependency you had. You will lose, you will gain, and you will have to keep going. If you found any part of this honest or helpful, please leave a like. If you want to hear more stories that are unpolished and real, subscribe. I'm curious. Have you ever had to choose between protecting someone you love and protecting the truth? Tell me in the comments. I read them and I'm listening.